Ladies and gentlemen, what we are witnessing at Davos this year is not merely a clash of personalities or a difference of policy preferences. It is, quite simply, the most severe transatlantic crisis in generations. And at the center of it, whether we like it or not, is former President Trump. The headlines tell us about angry European leaders, disrupted meetings, and unprecedented market uncertainty, but the deeper story is about how a single political actor, wielding both influence and unpredictability, can strain relationships that were carefully cultivated over decades. This is a moment that demands more than commentary. It demands an understanding of cause, consequence, and systemic fragility. Trump's actions at Davos have functioned as both symbolic and strategic shocks. His rhetoric, dismissive of long-standing alliances, did more than provoke reaction. It created real uncertainty in diplomatic channels and financial markets alike. Words, in this context, are not just words. They are signals to investors, policymakers, and global institutions that the rules of engagement have shifted. When the former president criticized NATO commitments, questioned trade agreements, and openly challenged European leaders on issues ranging from defense spending to energy policy, he did not simply depart from protocol, he destabilized expectations that have underpinned transatlantic cooperation since the end of the Second World War. The result is a crisis defined less by immediate policy consequences and more by the erosion of trust and predictability. Here is the hook. The shockwaves of this confrontation are systemic. European leaders now confront domestic and regional pressures amplified by a perceived American unpredictability. Markets, sensitive to political clarity, have responded with volatility, pricing in the risk that alliances cannot be taken for granted. Diplomatic channels, accustomed to routine consultation, now face a vacuum of certainty, where previously predictable negotiations are replaced by speculation over intent, interpretation, and follow-through. In short, the consequences of Trump's provocations extend far beyond the gala speeches and dinner tables of Davos. They ripple across defense, trade, energy, and geopolitical strategy, revealing how dependent transatlantic stability is on disciplined, consistent engagement. It is also critical to recognize that this crisis is not merely a reflection of personality. It exposes deeper structural vulnerabilities in global governance and the international order. Institutions designed to manage conflict, coordinate policy, and stabilize markets rely on norms as much as law, and those norms are fragile when challenged by actors willing to prioritize personal or political gain over collective predictability. By disregarding these norms, Trump has created a situation where old assumptions no longer hold, and Europe is forced to consider contingencies that had seemed unthinkable. A generation Davos 2025 will be remembered not for its speeches or networking events, but for the stark lesson it delivers. Global stability, however carefully constructed, is only as strong as the discipline of those who wield influence. Trump's interventions have shown that unilateral disruption, even by a former leader, can unravel decades of trust and strategic alignment in a matter of days. The transatlantic crisis is real, the consequences are tangible, and the questions it raises about alliance management, credibility, and systemic resilience will shape policy discussions for years to come. Observers and participants alike are now confronted with the uncomfortable reality that institutions, while powerful, are vulnerable, and that leadership, measured not just in office but in impact, can redefine the rules of international engagement in ways few anticipate. Former President Trump's actions at Davos have triggered the most severe transatlantic crisis in generations, undermining decades of trust and predictability in U.S.-Europe relations. The actions of former President Trump at Davos in 2025 represent more than isolated missteps or provocative commentary. They constitute a fundamental challenge to transatlantic stability that has been cultivated over decades. The severity of this disruption stems from both the visibility of his interventions and the enduring influence he wields as a former U.S. president. Diplomatic relationships between the United States and European nations have historically relied on continuity, predictability, and the gradual accumulation of trust. Policy expectations, negotiation protocols, and strategic commitments have all been developed under the assumption that U.S. leadership, whether Republican or Democratic, adheres to certain operational norms by publicly questioning alliances, undermining established agreements, and inserting unpredictability into high-level discussions. Trump has introduced a level of uncertainty that has not been seen in generations, effectively destabilizing what was once considered a secure and stable geopolitical alignment. This disruption is compounded by the symbolic weight of his actions. Davos, as a global forum, is a venue where both political and economic elites interpret signals about U.S. intentions, priorities, and reliability. When a former president with substantial political and media presence casts doubt on the consistency of American foreign policy, those signals reverberate far beyond the conference halls. European leaders are forced to respond not only to the content of statements, but also to the implications for their own domestic constituencies, financial markets, and security planning. Uncertainty generated at this level introduces a cascade effect. Defense planning, trade negotiations, and multinational cooperation all must be reassessed, sometimes in real time, to account for the altered perception of U.S. reliability. The disruption is also practical. Allies who rely on the United States for both economic and security commitments face a strategic dilemma. They must evaluate whether assurances given by current administrations are credible in the context of high-profile interventions that challenge continuity. Decisions regarding military readiness, joint exercises, and coordinated responses to global crises are now complicated by the potential for unilateral deviation from prior agreements. Financial markets, which are highly sensitive to political stability, register these uncertainties in asset prices, investment strategies, and risk assessments, translating diplomatic instability into tangible economic consequences. The severity of Trump's impact at Davos demonstrates that individual political actors, even outside formal office, can destabilize long-standing international relationships. This moment underscores the fragility of trust in global governance structures and reveals the extent to which transatlantic alignment depends on predictable leadership. The events at Davos 2025 illustrate that the combination of visibility, influence, and disregard for institutional norms can generate systemic uncertainty that reverberates across both diplomatic and economic domains, threatening stability that has been painstakingly constructed over generations. The rhetoric and public challenges issued by former President Trump at Davos in 2025 have created both symbolic and strategic shocks with consequences that extend well beyond the immediate context of the forum. By openly questioning the commitments of NATO, criticizing long-standing trade agreements, and directly challenging European leaders on issues ranging from defense spending to energy policy, Trump disrupted expectations that have underpinned transatlantic relations for decades. These statements carry weight not simply because of their content, but because of the credibility and visibility of the individual delivering them. The implications are manifold, affecting diplomatic communication, financial markets, and the broader perception of U.S. reliability in international affairs. The symbolic impact of Trump's rhetoric is particularly significant. Davos serves as a global stage where political, corporate, and institutional actors interpret the intentions and priorities of major powers. When a figure of Trump's stature publicly signals skepticism toward alliances and agreements, it introduces a layer of uncertainty that is interpreted as a potential shift in policy, even if formal administration positions remain unchanged. European governments, accustomed to predictable channels of negotiation, are forced to respond to a dual reality: the official stance of the U.S. administration and the amplified statements of a highly influential former leader. This creates a cognitive dissonance in diplomatic circles where careful calculation and adherence to precedent are critical, and where any ambiguity can have cascading consequences for coordination on security, trade, and energy issues. Strategically, the effects of such public challenges are immediate and measurable. Financial markets, sensitive to political risk, adjust quickly to perceived instability or unpredictability in transatlantic relations. Investors respond to the uncertainty generated by Trump's statements by reassessing exposure to European and U.S. markets, adjusting portfolios, and pricing in potential disruptions to trade and cooperation. This can amplify volatility, affecting currency valuations, bond yields, and stock indices. Policymakers, in turn, must account for these market reactions when considering their own responses, creating a feedback loop in which rhetoric at a high-profile forum influences both strategic decision-making and economic stability. Moreover, the direct targeting of European leaders and multilateral agreements exacerbates the systemic impact. By publicly questioning the reliability of allies and the enforceability of agreements, Trump undermines the assumption of consistent U.S. engagement that underlies long-term planning and cooperative strategies. Defense planning, trade negotiations, and multilateral initiatives must all contend with the possibility that commitments may be reconsidered, delayed, or weakened. This strategic uncertainty forces actors to hedge against risk, reallocate resources, and reassess contingency plans, demonstrating that rhetoric, particularly when amplified by prominence and media reach, functions as a tangible instrument of disruption in international relations. The consequences of Trump's provocations at Davos extend far beyond immediate policy disputes, revealing systemic vulnerabilities in transatlantic relations that touch defense, trade, energy, and broader geopolitical coordination. While the initial reactions to his remarks focused on interpersonal tensions and headline-grabbing conflicts with European leaders, the deeper impact lies in the structural disruption these statements introduce. Alliances that were previously reinforced through decades of routine consultation and shared strategic objectives are now subjected to uncertainty, forcing governments, institutions, and corporations to reassess the reliability of established frameworks. This uncertainty does not remain isolated to the halls of Davos. It propagates through the interconnected architecture of international relations, influencing decision-making at multiple levels. In defense policy, the implications are immediate and tangible. NATO, long considered the backbone of transatlantic security, relies on the expectation of consistent commitment from member states, particularly the United States. Public challenges to these commitments, even by a former president, create doubt about enforcement, financial contributions, and operational readiness. European governments must now evaluate whether contingency measures are sufficient to mitigate potential lapses in coordination, while military planners face the risk that joint exercises, strategic deployments, and shared intelligence arrangements may be disrupted. Such uncertainty complicates long-term strategic planning and introduces the possibility that regional deterrence postures could be weakened, creating space for adversarial actors to exploit perceived instability. Trade and energy sectors experience similar ripple effects. Markets depend on predictable policy environments, and sudden questioning of existing agreements undermines confidence in the reliability of cross-border contracts, investment flows, and regulatory compliance. Energy markets, already sensitive to geopolitical pressures, are particularly vulnerable. Statements questioning transatlantic coordination on energy security or pricing can trigger volatility in supply chains and financial instruments, affecting both corporations and consumers. Trade negotiations, which require sustained dialogue and trust, become increasingly fraught when participants must account for the possibility of abrupt shifts in U.S. positions, even if those shifts originate outside the formal executive apparatus. Beyond defense, trade, and energy, the broader geopolitical architecture is destabilized because multilateral initiatives depend on predictable participation. Climate agreements, coordinated sanctions, humanitarian aid commitments, and international regulatory frameworks all rely on assumptions of continuity and adherence to established norms. Trump's interventions disrupt those assumptions, forcing international actors to develop contingency strategies, reallocate resources, and hedge against risk. The cumulative effect is a form of structural uncertainty in which the normal mechanisms of coordination, enforcement, and planning are weakened, illustrating that the impact of provocative actions extends far beyond rhetoric, reshaping the operational landscape of transatlantic and global governance. The crisis emerging from Trump's interventions at Davos exposes the fragility of international norms and highlights how dependent global institutions are on disciplined, predictable engagement. Multilateral frameworks, alliances, and cooperative mechanisms operate not solely through codified agreements or legal instruments, but through expectations of consistency, mutual respect, and adherence to established procedures. These norms function as informal yet powerful constraints that enable coordination among states with differing priorities, domestic pressures, and strategic interests. When a prominent political actor disregards or openly challenges these conventions, the resulting disruption is structural rather than incidental, revealing the vulnerability of systems that depend as much on trust and precedent as on formal treaties. This fragility becomes particularly apparent in the context of transatlantic relations, where decades of post-war cooperation have relied on both explicit commitments and the implicit assumption of continuity. European governments, accustomed to a predictable United States leadership role, have developed defense strategies, trade policies, and energy partnerships under the expectation that these norms will be upheld. The introduction of public skepticism or unilateral critique by a figure of Trump's prominence undermines these assumptions, compelling allies to reassess risk, contingency planning, and reliance on multilateral frameworks. Even without immediate legal implications, the breach of normative expectations generates operational uncertainty, forcing adjustments across diplomatic, economic, and strategic domains. International institutions are designed to absorb shocks and manage disagreements, yet they are inherently dependent on actors behaving in ways that conform to collective expectations. When norms are disregarded, coordination becomes more complex, decision-making slows, and previously reliable mechanisms for negotiation and enforcement lose efficacy. Market actors and policymakers alike respond to these disruptions, pricing in risk and uncertainty that can affect investments, alliances, and policy outcomes. In essence, the erosion of norms functions as a multiplier, converting rhetorical challenges into tangible consequences that propagate through systems of governance and economic interaction. Moreover, the challenge to norms highlights the limits of institutional authority in the absence of compliance by key participants. While rules, agreements, and formal procedures exist, their effectiveness depends on consistent engagement and mutual recognition of legitimacy. When a powerful actor signals a willingness to ignore or reinterpret these frameworks for political or personal advantage, the structural integrity of institutions is compromised. Allies must then navigate a more fragmented landscape where enforcement mechanisms are weakened, expectations are uncertain, and strategic calculations must incorporate contingencies that were previously unnecessary. The Davos confrontation illustrates that international stability is contingent not only on the existence of agreements, but on the disciplined behavior of participants, and that violations of these norms, even if symbolic, can trigger systemic disruption with long-lasting implications. Davos 2025 serves as a stark reminder that leadership and influence, even from a former political figure, can profoundly reshape global stability, demonstrating the enduring impact individual actors have on institutional resilience. While formal authority may reside within elected or appointed offices, visibility, reputation, and the perception of power allow prominent individuals to influence expectations, recalibrate alliances, and introduce uncertainty into complex international systems. The presence of a figure such as Trump, who commands both media attention and political loyalty, transforms what might otherwise be symbolic statements into catalysts for tangible shifts in policy, strategy, and market behavior, underscoring the capacity of personal influence to alter the functioning of institutions designed for collective governance. The effects of this influence are multidimensional. In diplomatic terms, European leaders and institutional representatives must account not only for official positions, but also for public pronouncements that may contradict or complicate those positions. Negotiations that rely on predictability, mutual understanding, and incremental consensus building are disrupted when statements from high-profile actors cast doubt on commitments or signal potential reversals. In practical terms, contingency planning, strategic alignment, and resource allocation must now incorporate scenarios that previously would have been deemed unlikely, introducing inefficiencies and delaying implementation of agreed-upon initiatives. Economic and financial systems are similarly affected. Markets are highly sensitive to perceived stability, and the amplification of risk by prominent actors generates measurable volatility. Investors, corporations, and governments interpret the signals sent at high-profile events as indicators of policy direction, reliability of partnerships, and potential regulatory or trade shifts. The visibility of Trump's interventions magnifies this effect, transforming rhetorical challenges into quantifiable economic consequences, from fluctuations in stock indices to adjustments in foreign investment and trade strategy. The perception of unpredictability, when reinforced by reputation and prior behavior, becomes itself a structural factor influencing decision-making across sectors. Beyond immediate disruptions, the Davos scenario illustrates the broader lesson that global institutions are not self-correcting in the absence of disciplined engagement by influential actors. Alliances, treaties, and multilateral frameworks depend on behavioral norms and expectations as much as on codified rules. When an actor of significant influence challenges those norms, the integrity of the system is tested, revealing vulnerabilities that can persist long after the initial intervention. It underscores that institutional resilience is contingent not only on formal design, but on consistent, predictable engagement by participants whose authority or influence commands attention and shapes perception. Ultimately, Davos 2025 demonstrates that influence extends beyond formal office and that leadership is measured not merely by policy execution, but by the capacity to affect trust, coordination, and systemic stability. High-profile interventions can recalibrate expectations, force reassessments across allied networks, and generate ripple effects that are felt across diplomatic, economic, and strategic domains, highlighting the enduring power of individual actors to shape the international order.